The head of the Varro concern was dying, and no one in the room was willing to say it plainly. That was the first thing Wren Callaghan noticed when she slipped through the service door at 3 in the morning. Not the armed men folded into the corridor outside like furniture. Not the hush that had replaced the usual antiseptic bustle of the 9th floor, but the specific way the specialists stood. Shoulders curved inward, tablets held to their chests like shields. The posture of people who had already decided the outcome and were simply waiting for the body to agree. Sable Varro lay at the center of it all, in a private room that had been stripped of anything unnecessary and restocked with equipment that did not belong in any standard hospital wing. The ventilator beside the bed was a model Wren had only seen in surgical theater. 3 separate IV lines ran from a central port in his forearm to bags of fluid hanging on a chrome rack, each one a different shade of pale saline, plasma, something amber-tinted she didn't recognize. His chest moved, but only because the machine told it to. She had read the admission notes. 4 days ago, Sable Varro had been sitting in the private dining room of the Stock Exchange Club, signing a contract that would have redirected half the shipping tonnage moving through the Great Lakes. He drank a cup of black tea. 20 minutes later, his right hand stopped working. By the time his people reached him, his speech was gone too. The notes described a suspected neurovascular event. The specialists had since revised this to atypical multi-system toxidrome of unknown origin. In clinical language, this meant, something is killing him and we do not know what. Dr. Priya Sondhi, who had been flown in from Johns Hopkins and whose credentials occupied half a page, stood at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed. She was speaking quietly to Dr. Marcus Olin, a cardiologist whose name appeared on 3 different buildings in Chicago. Their voices were low, but Wren, who had spent years perfecting the art of being unnoticed in the corners of rooms, caught enough. Organ function deteriorating in sequence, cardiac rhythm increasingly erratic. No binding agent was touching whatever was in his bloodstream. A large man sat in the chair nearest the window. He hadn't moved since Wren arrived. His name, she knew from the other nurses, was Gideon Falk, and he was not the sort of man who sat in chairs quietly under normal circumstances. Right now, he was doing exactly that, his hands open on his knees, staring at the floor with the expression of someone doing math they already knew the answer to. 4 other men stood in the corridor. They wore dark suits and watched the door. One of them had looked at Wren when she entered, assessed her in a single flat second, and looked away. She was used to that. The looking away was familiar. She was a broad woman, plain-faced, wearing scrubs 2 sizes too large because she ordered them that way easier to move in, harder to be seen in. She had a surgical tech's badge on a lanyard, a penlight in her breast pocket, and no reason, by any visible metric, to be in this room. She crossed to the supply cart in the far corner and began quietly restocking gloves. Nobody watched her do it. She was already a shadow on the wall. Sable Varro's hands, resting still on top of the blanket, were the color of old chalk. She noticed that too. The first night, she had come in to replace the saline bag and stayed for 2 hours. It wasn't protocol. Nothing about the next 72 hours would be protocol. But the specialists left at midnight, and Gideon stepped into the corridor to make calls, and the armed men outside had no interest in the goings-on at the bedside, and Wren had found herself simply staying. She did the things no one else was doing. She turned him carefully onto his side every 90 minutes, so the pressure wouldn't build in his lower back. She moistened a cloth and ran it across his forehead, his jaw, the sharp lines of his cheekbones, where dried sweat had crusted at the edges of the ventilator straps. His skin was cold in a way that wasn't merely the room's temperature. It was a deeper cold, the kind that radiates outward when the body has stopped trying to maintain itself. She talked to him, quietly, the way she talked to herself when she was working through something not loudly enough to carry, not softly enough to feel performative. She told him about a book she'd been reading, a maritime history of the Great Lakes she'd found in a box at a church sale. She told him that the Edmund Fitzgerald had gone down in water only 600 feet deep, which she had always found quietly terrible. The idea of something massive and permanent, lying so close to the surface, and yet so completely unreachable. He didn't respond, of course. But his jaw, which had been clenched tight enough to show the muscle along his cheek, eased slightly by the second night. She didn't know if that meant anything medically. She noted it anyway. She was the one who stayed when everyone else found reasons to be elsewhere. She was the one who noticed the way his fingers would curl slightly around nothing, just before his blood pressure reading dropped. She was the one who kept the chart updated with observations that didn't fit the official theory. Small things, marginal things, the kind of notes that get skimmed and filed and forgotten in a case this complex. On the third night, she was holding his left hand, running her thumb across his knuckles the way she might with a patient who was frightened, and she brought his hand close to check the capillary refill. The overhead light was off. She used her pen light. The whites of his eyes, which were slightly open in the involuntary way of deep unconsciousness, were not white. They were faintly, distinctly amber, not yellow, not the deep saffron of liver jaundice, but something subtler, a warm, faint tint, like weak tea held up to a window. She held the pen light closer, looked again. The official notes said there was no hepatic involvement. Dr. Sondi had written it herself, and Wren was not a physician. She was a surgical technician who worked nights and read her dead father's pharmacology texts the way other people read fiction, because the apartment was quiet and the books were there, and they were one of the few things of his she'd kept. But she had read, in one of those texts, a chapter on synthetic analogues of tetrodotoxin compounds developed in research settings, never approved, never catalogued in standard toxicological databases. Her father had flagged the page. In his cramped handwriting along the margin, ocular, amber, tint, distinguishing marker, and easily missed. She did not say anything that night. She went home at 6 in the morning, sat at her kitchen table with the book open, and read the chapter 4 more times. By the 4th morning, the specialists had stopped pretending. Doctor Sondi called it a briefing, which was the clinical word for standing in front of Gideon Falk and telling him that his employer, the man he had spent 15 years protecting, was not going to survive the week. She used careful language. She spoke about the kidneys, the liver's reduced output, the cardiac arrhythmia that was becoming less responsive to the medications they'd tried. She did not use the word failure, but she arranged the facts around it so completely that the word wasn't necessary. Gideon listened. He stood with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and he listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question: "Is there anything left to try?" It wasn't phrased as a question. Sondi understood the distinction. "We've exhausted the standard protocols," she said, "and the non-standard ones. Without knowing the precise compound, we're treating symptoms rather than the cause. His system is resistant to everything we've introduced." Olen, who had been standing slightly behind Sondi in a way that suggested he'd been doing that for most of his career, added something about consulting additional specialists in the morning. Sondi silenced him with a slight shift of her weight. "We should discuss comfort measures," she said, very quietly. Gideon turned away from her and walked to the window. Outside, Lakeshore Drive was beginning to thicken with early commuter traffic, distant and indifferent. His reflection in the glass was blurred enough that the expression on his face was unreadable. The doctors excused themselves. They would review their notes. They would make calls. They would return. Wren had been in the corner, noting the morning vitals, updating the chart with the careful, small handwriting that had always made supervising nurses compliment her neatness. She had the amber tint notation in her own personal shorthand, in a pocket notebook she carried, cross-referenced against the chapter she had now read 11 times. She had a theory. The theory frightened her, not because she thought she was wrong, but because she was fairly certain she was right. And being right meant the treatment currently running into his veins was not merely failing. It was the problem. She looked at Sable Varro. His chest rose and fell, rose and fell. The machines kept their counts. His hands lay flat and open and cold. She looked at Gideon, who was still at the window, a large man made somehow smaller by stillness. She thought about the chapter. She thought about her father's handwriting in the margin, the particular urgency of it, as though even he had wanted someone to see that note and act on it. She took a breath. It wasn't a steadying breath. It was the kind that comes when you've already decided, and you're just waiting for your body to catch up. "Mr. Falk," she said. Her voice was quiet. She had a quiet voice, but he heard it. He turned from the window slowly, the way a man turns when he's been expecting someone to say something foolish and has already prepared his response. He looked at Wren the way the guard at the door had looked at her, a quick, cataloging assessment, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, just a recalibration. She was not, apparently, who he'd expected. "What?" he said. "I've been noting his ocular presentation for 3 nights," she said. "The whites of his eyes have an amber tint. It's faint. I almost missed it the first time. The official chart says no hepatic involvement, and that's correct in the conventional sense. His liver enzymes don't match a standard hepatic event. But the amber tint isn't coming from the liver. It's a secondary effect of a different compound entirely." Gideon stared at her. "I'm a surgical tech," she said, before he could ask. "My father was a pharmacologist. He studied synthesized tetrodotoxin analogs, compounds that mimic the presentation of cardiac arrest but operate through a separate pathway. They target the sodium channels differently, and they react badly, catastrophically, to the class of beta blockers. Dr. Sondi has been running since day 1. The silence that followed had weight to it. "You're telling me the treatment is making him worse," Gideon said. "I'm telling you I think it might be accelerating the cardiac decline." "Yes." He crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped in front of her. He was large enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze, which she did, because looking away was not an option she had given herself. "If you're wrong," he said, "you understand what happens." "If I'm wrong, the drip lines go back on and nothing changes," she said. "If I'm right, and we keep running them, he won't make it to this time tomorrow." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. She didn't flinch. She had spent enough nights alone with a dying man to have used up her flinching. "What do you need?" he said. She told him. The beta blocker drips had to stop. The cardiac stabilizer protocol had to shift to a different agent. She named it, spelled it out, watched him type it into his phone. She needed 30 minutes, the surgical kit on the lower shelf of the supply cart, and access to the nebulizer equipment that had been set aside unused since admission. The treatment for a tetrodotoxin analog wasn't systemic. It was respiratory aerosolized, targeted, and it required sustained manual administration because the automated delivery systems weren't calibrated for this concentration. 30 minutes, she said. "If nothing happens, you can call Dr. Sondi back." Gideon looked at Sable. Then, back at Wren. He nodded once. Short and definitive. The nod of a man who was out of other options and knew it. She moved to the supply cart. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She worked quickly, assembling the components with the economy of motion that came from years of surgical prep. No wasted gestures, everything in sequence. Her father's voice was in her head, from a memory so old it was more texture than sound, reading the compound ratios from his texts while she sat on the kitchen floor doing homework. She had absorbed it without trying, the way children absorb everything they live inside of. The amber tint, distinguishing marker, easily missed. She brought the nebulizer to the bedside and looked at the man on the bed for a long moment. "I'm going to try to help you," she said quietly. She didn't expect an answer. She wasn't looking for one. The nebulizer produced a thin, invisible mist. Under other circumstances, it would have been unremarkable standard equipment, used for respiratory treatments, humming at low volume. Wren calibrated the concentration with the kind of deliberate care she usually reserved for the surgical field, measuring twice, then once more, then setting the vial in place with a click that felt much louder than it was. The problem was the mask. Sable Varro's diaphragm was compromised. The tetrodotoxin analog didn't cause total respiratory paralysis. The ventilator was still moving air, but it had disrupted the autonomic response enough that any external assistance required sustained contact. The mask had to be held against his face with continuous, even pressure. If it shifted, the seal broke. If the seal broke, the aerosolized compound dispersed into the room rather than concentrating at the mucosal tissue where it needed to bind. The ventilator rhythm was 12 breaths per minute. She would have to breathe with him, manually, hands against the mask, her own breath setting the pace, her weight leaning forward to maintain the pressure, while his chest did what the machine told it to do, and she waited for his body to begin doing something on its own. Gideon stood at the foot of the bed. He didn't speak. She didn't ask him to. She reached forward, placed the mask over Sable's nose and mouth, and pressed her palms flat against the sides. The seal held. She could feel the faint vibration of the machine beneath her hands, the slow mechanical rise and fall of his chest, the absolute stillness everywhere else. She breathed. 12 per minute. She counted. 12 per minute. Steady, matching his rhythm the way you match a conversation, not interrupting, not leading, just existing alongside. The monitor beside the bed showed his heart rate at 31 beats per minute and falling. The number had been falling for 6 hours, in the slow, implacable way of something that had decided. 31. 29. The QRS complex on the readout had flattened at its peaks, the electrical signature of a heart being chemically strangled. She didn't look at the monitor. She kept her eyes on his face. His skin was stone cold beneath the edges of the mask, at his temples, along the line of his jaw where she could feel the structure of him through her palms. He had a strong face, sharp featured in a way that read as severity at a distance and as something else up close, a kind of precision, as though the angles of him had been cut with intent. She had noticed it during the nights of quiet caretaking, when there was no performance around him to distract from what he simply was. 4 minutes in, nothing had changed. 5 minutes. The monitor's beeping slowed further. 26. The sound altered slightly longer, pauses between peaks, the rhythm becoming effortful. Gideon made a low sound behind her that wasn't quite a word. She held the mask. She breathed. 12 per minute. At minute 7, Sable Varro's hands moved. Both of them. A small, involuntary curl, the fingers closing on nothing, then releasing. She felt rather than saw it, the shift in the mattress, a minute vibration reaching her through her arms, through the seal of the mask. Then his chest stopped, following the machine, and pulled in a breath of its own. It was rough and deep and urgent, the breath of someone surfacing. His back arched slightly. His hands gripped the blanket. The monitor spiked a single violent peak on the readout, then another. Then the rhythm broke open into something fast and erratic and alive, the heart doing what hearts do when they've remembered how. 40 beats. 52. 68. Wren pulled the mask back a careful inch, checked the seal, and held it. The ventilator alarm sounded, the machine registering that the patient was now competing with it, and she reached over with one hand to silence it while keeping the other pressed flat. 80 beats per minute. She realized her forehead was damp. Her arms were shaking slightly, not from exertion exactly, but from something that had been held very tight for a very long time and had just been given permission to loosen. She set the mask aside. Sable Varro's chest rose and fell on its own, slowly at first. Then, with the gathering confidence of something that had decided to continue after all, the room was very quiet. Gideon sat down heavily in the chair by the window, put his head in his hands, and did not make a sound. Some grief is too large for noise. Wren stood at the bedside. She placed 2 fingers at the pulse point on Sable's wrist, counted for 15 seconds, and multiplied by 4. 88 beats per minute, and strengthening. She wrote the number in her notebook. Her handwriting was steady. She put the notebook back in her pocket. The doctors returned at 6:47, alerted by the monitor's earlier spike, and they came into the room with the brisk certainty of people who had been summoned to confirm a death. "Doctor," Sondi reached the bedside first. She stopped. Sable Varro was not dead. He was not unconscious either. Or not entirely. His eyes had opened to partial slits during the 15 minutes since his breathing had stabilized, the deep olive of his irises visible in thin strips, taking in the ceiling with the unfocused patience of someone whose body was still catching up to the fact of its own survival. The ventilator had been disconnected. His respiratory rate was sitting at 16 and climbing toward normal. His color had changed in the way color changes when blood begins moving through channels that were nearly closed slowly, unevenly, with more warmth in the face and less in the extremities, but improving in the general direction. Dr. Olin said something about the beta blocker lines being disconnected. He said it with the rising note of an accusation. Gideon stood up from the chair. He crossed the room to where Dr. Olin was standing, stopped close enough that the doctor took a small unconscious step backward, and said, very quietly, "She was the one who stayed." The room went still. Sondi looked at Wren. Olin looked at Gideon. The armed men in the doorway, who had pressed forward at the sound of the monitor alarm, were watching everything with the flat, professional attention of people trained to read danger in a room. Dr. Sondi recovered first. She began a rapid, controlled voice explanation of her concerns regarding unauthorized protocol deviation, the liability implications for the facility, the necessity of a full incident review. She was professional and precise, and she did not look at Wren while she spoke, which was its own kind of assessment. "You are going to terminate this individual's access to the patient," she said to Gideon, "and we are going to document exactly what was administered before we can certify any continued care." Sable's eyes opened. Not partway, all the way. He had dark irises, a deep brown that was nearly black, ringed with something colder, and they opened with an alertness that was startling in a man who had been unconscious for 4 days. He did not look confused. He did not look like someone assembling the world from fragments. He looked like a man who had gone somewhere and returned with a very clear memory of the route. He scanned the room in the quiet, methodical way of someone who has trained himself not to let his eyes betray what he's thinking. He passed over the doctors. He paused on Gideon. Then he looked at the far corner of the room, where Wren had pressed herself against the supply cart, with her hands in the pockets of her scrubs and her pulse visible in her throat. He looked at her for a long moment. "Who is that?" he said. His voice was raw from 4 days of the ventilator, roughed down to something quieter than his natural register, but it carried. Gideon glanced at Wren, then back at his employer. "Her name is Wren," he said. "She's been here every night. She's the reason you're talking." He paused. "She was the one who stayed." Sable held Wren's gaze. She wanted to look at her shoes. She made herself not. She stood against the supply cart with her hands in her pockets, and held his gaze across the length of the room, because looking away felt like the wrong answer to a question she wasn't sure she'd been asked yet. The doctors were still in the room when Sable said, without inflection, "Give us a minute." It wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, which meant it was addressed to everyone. Sondi began to object. She had a professional obligation, she said, a duty of documentation. But one of the men from the corridor had materialized at her elbow before she finished the sentence, and the objection dissolved into the corridor, along with both physicians and the hospital administrator, who had appeared at some point and now disappeared again. Gideon stayed. Sable let him stay. He looked at Wren. "Come here," he said. She walked to the bedside. Slowly, not because she was reluctant, but because her legs felt uncertain, which was a physiological fact she would not have chosen to display. She stopped at the rail and looked at him. The sharp angles of his face softer now with returning circulation, a darkness beneath his eyes from 4 days of the body fighting itself, his hands resting at his sides with the deliberate stillness of a man who has learned to be careful with his gestures. "What did you do?" he said. It was the same flat, non-question Gideon had used. She explained it. Briefly, without hedging the amber tint, her father's texts, the sodium channel mechanism, the interaction between the existing treatment protocol and the compound. She described what she'd administered and how. She kept her voice even. She was aware that the explanation she was giving was the kind that either established her as competent or as dangerously reckless, and she had decided on the way to the bedside that she would present it without apology and let him decide which. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your father taught you this," he said. "His books did." After he was gone, another pause. He was looking at her with the same methodical attention he'd turned on the room when he woke up, the measuring look of a man who catalogues people as a professional habit. She found, to her slight surprise, that she didn't mind it. It was different from the usual looking away. He was looking at her, not past her. "Why?" he said. "You don't work for me. You had nothing to gain." She thought about the honest answer and gave it. "You were there," she said. "You were cold and you were there, and the people who were supposed to help you had stopped trying." She paused. "I didn't think about the rest of it." He studied her for another long moment. "What's your name?" "Wren Callaghan." He said nothing for a second. Then, "Wren." Flat, considering, as though weighing the weight of it. "You're not going back to the hospital. Not tonight. Not yet." She started to object. She had a shift. She had obligations. She had a life that existed in a different register from all of this, but he had already looked past her to Gideon, and whatever passed between them in that look was brief and decisive. "She stays close," he said, "until I know what we're dealing with." Wren looked at him. He looked back. He wasn't asking. She thought about arguing. She thought about the drive home, the quiet apartment, the book she'd left open on the kitchen table. She thought about his hands, cold and open on the blanket, and how different they looked now. "Okay," she said. The estate sat on the lake's north shore, behind a gate that was decorative only in the sense that a courthouse is decorative. The real deterrent was invisible. It was a long, low building of dark brick and glass, set back from the water by a stretch of dead winter lawn that nobody had raked in months, surrounded by mature oaks, stripped bare by November. Wren arrived in the back of a car with tinted windows and spent her first hour walking through rooms she hadn't been invited into because no one had told her not to, and she had learned a long time ago that permission withheld is not the same as permission denied. She was given a room on the east side, smaller than the others she passed, but not small, with a window that looked out over the water and a bookshelf someone had stocked with titles that suggested a general brief rather than any knowledge of what she actually read. She moved 3 of them to the bedside table anyway. Some books were better than no books. Her role was clear in function and strange in practice. She monitored Sable's recovery vitals twice daily, medication schedule, the gradual reintroduction of solid food, and then light movement. He was a cooperative patient in the way that powerful men are sometimes cooperative. He followed instructions when the rationale was given, questioned everything that wasn't, and pushed hard against any limitation he judged excessive. He had been back at his desk within 4 days, which was early. She told him so. "I have things that require attention," he said, not looking up from whatever he was reading. "Your cardiac output is still at 63% of baseline. Is 63% incompatible with reading?" She had wanted to say yes and couldn't, medically. "No," she said. "Then leave me to it," he said. And then, after she'd turned to go, "Wren," she turned back. "Thank you," he said. He said it plainly, the way someone says a factual thing. He was still looking at whatever he was reading, but he said it. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed for a while. The weeks had a rhythm. Mornings were medical. She had her routines. He had his. They overlapped briefly over coffee in the kitchen where she took her notes, and he reviewed whatever had been forwarded from his office. Evenings were harder to categorize. He would find her, usually in the library, and ask questions that had nothing to do with his health. What she thought about a particular shipping route's legal exposure, whether a contract clause she had no reason to understand struck her as standard or unusual. She read quickly. She had opinions about things, and he seemed to want them in a way that was genuine and slightly disorienting. He watched her. Not in the way men sometimes watched women: assessing, comparative, possessive. He watched her the way she watched him when she was tracking his recovery, with attention, with the particular respect of someone who believed what they were observing was worth observing. She hadn't been watched that way before. She wasn't sure she'd been watched at all, in the way she meant. She had been present. She had been useful. She had been appreciated in the abstract way of reliable things. This was different. She caught herself thinking about it at night, facing the ceiling of her room with the lake sounds coming through the window, the creak of ice forming at the shallows, the soft knock of a branch against glass. She thought about the cold of his hands during those first 3 nights, and how different it was to sit across a table from him now, with warmth returned to his face and a dry, careful humor beginning to emerge from beneath the severity, like shoreline revealed, as the water pulls back. Somewhere in the estate, men were tracing lines back to whoever had put the compound in his tea. The tension of it ran beneath everything in the clipped conversations she overheard, in the way Gideon's jaw tightened sometimes at nothing, in the way Sable's eyes went somewhere cold and flat when he thought no one was looking. She thought about the amber tint in his eyes, and the chapter in her father's book. She wondered what else she'd absorbed, without knowing she'd needed it. The library was the best room in the house. She had decided this privately and without consultation, on her 8th day, when she discovered it occupied the corner of the building where the east and north windows met, so that on clear days the lake was visible in 2 directions at once. The shelves ran floor to ceiling, and were organized in a way that suggested someone had cared very deeply about a system that was now being only partially honored: books slotted in sideways, others pulled forward without being returned to place. She found herself straightening them when she worked in there, unconsciously, the way she straightened equipment on a surgical tray. She was cataloging Sable's medications on a Thursday evening, cross-referencing the estate pharmacy's stock list against what she'd been administering, checking for gaps or inconsistencies, the kind of routine maintenance that was technically her job, and also the kind she would have done even if it weren't, because she was made that way. Her father had been made that way too. She'd inherited it like eye color. The anomaly was in the order records. A specific compound, one she recognized by its synthesized prefix, a synthetic sodium channel agent. The class that included the family of toxins she'd identified in Sable's blood presentation had been ordered through the estate pharmacy 11 days before the stock exchange club. The order was logged under a supplier she didn't recognize, cross-referenced to an internal account number. The account number belonged to Callum Varro. She read the line 3 times. Callum was Sable's cousin. She had met him twice in the 3 weeks at the estate, a lean, pleasant-looking man in his early 30s who wore his ease with inherited wealth, the way some people wore good shoes, as something meant to be noticed. He had been kind to her in the practiced, effortless way of someone who had spent their life being kind to people who didn't matter. He brought her tea the second time they spoke. She had thanked him and thought nothing more about it. She looked at the order record again. The date, the compound, the account number. She thought about the chapter in her father's book, the specific synthesis pathway, the careful construction of something that would look like cardiac failure on a standard tox screen, something that wouldn't appear in a database because it had never been approved, had barely been documented. You'd have to know where to look to find it. You'd have to know where to look to order it. She closed the file on the tablet. She sat in the library with the lake visible through 2 windows and the lamps on low, and the book she'd been reading face down on the side table, and she stayed very still for a long moment. Then she heard the door behind her close. She hadn't heard him come in, which was the first thing. She was not someone who failed to notice entrances. She was too accustomed to reading rooms for that. But the library door had opened and closed without sound, and when she turned, Callum Varro was standing against it. He was wearing what he always wore, clean, well-cut, understated. His hands were in his pockets. He was smiling, the same pleasant ease she'd catalogued before. But the smile was wrong in a way she could feel before she could name. It was the right shape, but the wrong weight. The expression of someone working from memory rather than feeling. "Late night," he said. Cataloging, she said. She did not reach for the tablet, which was face down on the desk. She did not look at it. Quiet work, he said. He pushed off the door and moved to the nearer shelf, trailing a finger along the spines in the absent way people do when they want to seem at ease. He wasn't at ease. She could see it in the slight rigidity of his shoulders, the deliberate quality of the hand on the shelf. Must be strange, living here. Not your world. It's fine, she said. He glanced at the desk, at the tablet, face down, then at her. Find anything interesting? She held very still. Her back was against the reading chair. The shelf was to her left, the window to her right, the desk between her and the room's open space. The door was 12 feet behind him, and he was standing in front of it. The windows didn't open from the inside. She'd checked in her first week, out of the habit she'd developed of knowing her exits. Old habit, from years of working nights in buildings that emptied out. Routine check, she said. Nothing unusual. He nodded slowly. The smile stayed where it was, fixed like something pinned. That's good, he said. Routine is good, uncomplicated. He moved to the desk, picked up the tablet, and turned it over. The screen had gone dark, but the file had been open. If he knew the access pattern, and she had the feeling, which was congealing into certainty, that he knew more about this estate's systems than he appeared to, he would be able to see the last open file in the audit log. He set the tablet down, without turning it on. Wren, he said. Her name in his mouth sounded different from how Sable said it. Flatter. I want you to understand something. He sat on the edge of the desk, facing her, his posture open and relaxed. What happened to Sable was genuinely terrible. I was devastated. Still am. And what you did, that took real courage. He paused. But there's a version of this where you leave tomorrow. Go back to your hospital, your shifts, your regular life. No complications, no questions. And if I stay, she said. He looked at her for a moment with no expression at all. Then the smile came back, smaller now. Then things get complicated, he said. For you. She thought about the tablet. She thought about the order log, the account number, the 11 days. She thought about Sable at his desk, saying thank you in the same register as a fact. She thought about cold hands and amber-tinted eyes, and a book left open in a dead man's apartment that she had never been able to throw away. I'll take complicated, she said. The smile dropped. He stood up from the desk, and the pleasant ease went with it, and what was left was something calibrated and cold. He moved toward her, and she held her position, back against the chair, hands at her sides, because there was nowhere to go, and she had decided, sometime in the last 30 seconds, that she was done moving backward. The door to the library opened. Sable Varro walked in like he owned the room, which he did, and like he had been expecting to find exactly this, which it became clear in the following seconds he had. He did not move quickly. He crossed the threshold and stopped just inside the door, and he looked at Callum, the way you look. At a problem you have been working on for a long time and have finally solved. Callum turned. The pleasantness was gone completely now. In its place was something Wren recognized, the stillness of a man, calculating the distance between himself and an exit that was no longer available. Cal, Sable said. Nothing else. 2 men from the corridor moved into the room behind him, flanking the door. They didn't approach. They didn't need to. I've been reviewing the pharmacy records, Sable said, since day 6. He spoke quietly. Not the forced quiet of someone controlling anger, the natural quiet of someone who had put the anger somewhere else for later. I kept thinking I was wrong about the account code. I kept checking the overlap dates. He took a step into the room. I wasn't wrong. Callum said, Sable, listen, don't. The word came out flat and final, a door closing. You had 11 years of trust, and you spent it on a syndicate payment and a shipping route. He stopped 4 feet from his cousin and looked at him steadily. I keep trying to understand what you needed that I hadn't given you. Callum's jaw worked. Something moved across his face that might have been genuine, or might have been the last performance of a man who had run out of other moves. "It wasn't personal," he said. "The business." "It was entirely personal," Sable said. "You sat across from me at every table. You were at the club that night. You handed me the cup yourself." A pause, short and precise. "Don't tell me it wasn't personal, Cal." Callum looked at Wren then. A brief, sideways glance, assessing. She looked back. "She found it," he said. "Not an accusation. Something emptier than that." "She did," Sable said. "There was nothing after that." Gideon materialized from the corridor he had apparently been standing just outside the library, which explained nothing and everything about how the last several minutes had unfolded. He crossed the room with the unhurried efficiency of someone executing a task he had been asked to do and had agreed to do. He took Callum by the arm, and Callum did not resist, because there was nothing left in resistance now, and the two men left the library, and the two men at the door followed, and then the room was quiet. Sable stood in the middle of the library for a moment. His back was to her. She watched his shoulders rise and fall once, not a breath of relief, something heavier, the kind of exhale that carries weight out of the body along with air. He turned. Wren had slid down against the reading chair at some point in the last 30 seconds. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the cushion and her knees pulled up and her hands pressed flat on the rug, and she was shaking in the way the body shakes when it has been holding a very tight thing and has finally been given permission to stop. Sable crossed the room. He lowered himself to one knee in front of her. He looked at her hands. He reached out and took both of them in his. They were cold. Her hands were always cold. She ran cold, had run cold her whole life, the way some people do, burning the heat inward. But they were colder than usual now, trembling slightly, pressed flat against the rug as though she needed the ground. His hands were warm. That was the thing she registered first, the thing that moved through her before she was ready for it, the specific warmth of living palms, the warmth she had tried to give him across 3 nights when he lay stone cold and flickering on a hospital bed, returned to him and now returned to her. He wrapped both his hands around hers and held them. He didn't say anything for a moment. She was grateful for that. The shaking slowed as the warmth transferred, slowly, the way warmth does not all at once but in degrees, starting at the palms and working outward. "The records," she said eventually. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You said day 6. "Day 6, he said. "I saw the timestamp on the pharmacy order, and I started pulling thread." He paused. "I needed to be certain before I moved." "You knew when you found me in the library tonight." "I knew Callum had gone in," he said. "I was watching the camera feed." She looked at their hands. "You could have come sooner." "I could have," he said. He didn't offer anything else, and she understood after a second that he was not going to apologize for the calculation, because it had been a calculation, and it had worked, and he was built for that kind of honesty. She thought she respected it, though she wasn't entirely sure yet. "I'm still shaking," she said. "I know." She looked up at him. He was close, closer than she usually let herself register, because registering it had felt like a luxury she hadn't earned. His face was fully recovered now, the color and the sharpness returned, the darkness under his eyes fading with weeks of proper sleep. The severity she'd first read in him she now understood differently, not hardness but precision, the same thing in a different material. He said, "You're the one who stayed," softly, like a fact. She held his gaze. She thought about the corner of the room, the supply cart, the pen light and the amber eyes and the chapter with the handwriting in the margin. She thought about the moment she had decided, across 4 years of night shifts and borrowed knowledge and a life lived in the edges of other people's importance, that being invisible was just a thing that had happened to her, not a thing she was. "I stay when it matters," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled her gently forward, off the floor, up and onto her feet, and he didn't let go of her hands when she was standing. She was close enough to feel the warmth of him, the steady, unhurried warmth of a man who had found the temperature he intended to keep. Outside, the lake moved against the shore in the dark. The ice that had been forming in the shallows all month was beginning, quietly to hold. Her hands were warm. She let them stay that way.